you lived in Granby for 11 years and you left in 57, it's probably late 40s you moved there?
Yes, it would be.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard for me to think of years. I forget very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a happy time. And then we moved to Sherbrooke. And within a year and a half, we heard that the construction was opening in Kingston. Les had worked under Ottawa and Montreal before. And when he heard there was going to be an opening in Kingston, he applied immediately. We wanted to come back because my parents were getting old and we liked Kingston and hoped to be back there to retire.
Going back to when you first married, tell me about your honeymoon.
Oh, we didn't have much money ahead, that's sure. One of the bellmen who worked for Les loaned him his car. And we just took a motor trip to Niagara, and we went on to Fort Erie to see my two brothers who were called away the weekend of our wedding. They missed the wedding. They were called to go back and work on the ship. It's up in Fort Erie.
Mm-hmm.
So we purposely went up there and saw them, visited Niagara. Came back through northern highways to Renfrew, and back down to Kingston. That was the extent of our trip. We came back with very little.
Now, in Kingston, you had some dear friends, Harriet and Harold Clark.
Yes.
Tell me about how you came to know them and
how
how that friendship
is still, we're great friends. In 1932, Les had groups of men working, building the telephone lines from Kingston to Bath Village. And instead of living in a hotel in town, he rented rooms at Clark's tourist home, it was then.
Mm-hmm.
And they stayed there for 2 or 3 months, putting that line in. And they became great friends there. So after our honeymoon, we went there for a dance at the big pavilion, and they invited our friends to celebrate. The following day, we decided to go home to Elgin to pick up our wedding gifts and such. And on the way, Les was very ill. We stopped at the doctor's in Elgin and found he had rheumatic fever. So he was ill for 6 weeks. Took care of him at home at my parents' place. And then he came up to Kingston, had his tonsils removed in August, and he recovered from them. So it was a rather difficult start there.
What are the close friends as you think back over the years?
The Clarks are very close, the Clarks, and of course those girls that I went to boarding school. We kept in touch as some of them married, and others, like Frances McCauley, visited me from New York all the time. She was in the United Nations. And we stayed close friends right through, kept in touch all the time. 6 people for 70 years is a record.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
What fun times? Describe some of the fun times that you had with those friends.
Whenever we got together, it was fun. We talk about the boarding school days and so on. And when I retired from school and had time, I had garden parties and invited all those I could find. Some I didn't know their married names, but I'd ask one to find some others. And the first time I had a reunion was 1977. And there were 40 people showed up. From then on, I had one each July in my garden at home, and the number continued to be greater because more people heard about it and came. I did that for 5 years.
How about grandchildren? How did you feel about your first
I
grandchild?
just loved having them. The only one that I was not present at her birth, but I was sitting waiting in the hospital, was Pat's first little girl. The others were, I couldn't go to help them because I was teaching and so on. So she's the only one.
What was the feeling with the first grandchild when you held it?
I can't describe it. Almost like holding your own, over again.
Now where was that?
Who's the eldest?
Anne.
Les and I, no, they brought her home first at 7 months old. And that was lovely. We met the plane in Toronto to see her. It was great. I have pictures of the 4 generations there when she came. And then for Anne's third one, we drove across, trip right to Portland, 1964. Then after that were the other ones, Jean's and Terry's are about the same age. And yours then in Kingston. And then Pat in Port Hope.
What about the first great-grandchild? What kind of feelings did you have when you heard about that?
Oh, I was thrilled. That was Janet's in Oregon. And that was very nice. I went when she was 1 year old to see her. Took a trip in June. And she turned a year old in May. And that was fun to see her. She was walking and talking and made friends with me immediately because I had a necklace on.
Mhm.
That was cute.
So thinking back over the years now, and over the married years, you were married for how long? From
It'll be
1935 until?
It'll be 60 years in the spring.
So what have been
next
now?
day, June, you know.
Right, and Dad died in 1967.
67.
So you had been married about
32 years.
32 years
That's
at that
all.
time.
Mhm.
Now thinking back over that period of time that you were married, what 2 or 3 real happy things come to your mind? When you think back about that, if you had to name them off quickly, what happy times do you remember about that? Or what challenging times do you remember about those married years?
Well, there were some difficult times, and as we were, the children, ready to do different things, Anne was in training, and there was no English high school for Jean, so we had to really have a struggle that year to pay and put Jean in a boarding school. Those were the difficult years. And then when Anne graduated, we took a trip to Dakota to meet her arts people. And let's see, then we moved to Kingston. And what year was Jean married? Gotta think of that.
67? 68?
Yes, 67, the day Dad died, or the year Dad died, both girls were married. Jean in July and Terry in September. That's quite a lot of happening. A death and 2 weddings in 1 year.
Name some other happy times.
Well, I was very happy in taking up a career again. I was so lonely when he was gone, and I had started a kindergarten at home, thinking I would just do it as, you know, an occupation, not particularly steady job. But when he died and I was invited to come to the school, I went right back to that at 55 and taught for 8 years.
When you moved to Amherst in 1960, you built a little kindergarten room in the basement. How did that come
Well,
about?
I went to play cards with some of the ladies, and they asked if I was going to work, because most of the women were there in Amherst who were working. The husbands would go to work, and so would the wife for the day. Nothing much to do. So they said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I had in mind I'd like to have a kindergarten. I've always loved little children." And they all said, "Oh, what a good idea. We don't have any." They hadn't put them in the schools yet. So when I went home, it was about midnight, and I told my husband, and half asleep, he said, "Okay, I'll make you one." So he was always very cooperative. So within a couple of weeks, he took time, holidays, and built the kindergarten for me. And I opened with 10 children there, and that grew. At the end, I had them registered for 3 years ahead.
Wow.
Pages of children. And one dad met me one day, and they'd had a new baby overnight at the hospital, and he said, "I just came to register another boy, because if you didn't put your name on, I couldn't take them all. I had limited space. Could take just so many per square foot in the house." And then at the school, it was lovely. Both school boards decided to put the kindergartens in the same year. And I was asked by Mr. Van Lyman, who was chairman of the board, to give mine up and go to the school and teach. And I loved those years. I had a great time.
They really filled
And
it
they
out.
gave me a lovely reception, or not reception, but a going away retirement party when I finished, and gave me a trip to Europe and a set of luggage, so I took a nice trip.
You mentioned Aunt Ursula had helped you go through
Oh, yes. She
teachers college.
paid my way to teachers
How
college.
was the relationship with her? How did you
She just
know her? How did?
Well, she's Mom's sister, and she was never married. She was a nurse and a teacher, and then assisted this uncle doctor where she lived. And she just sort of was very fond of me as a little child. So when I was about 7, she took me every summer for a couple of weeks vacation. And that was heaven to me, to be in that beautiful home and, you know, be treated so nicely. And she taught me a lot of things. She was a really lovely lady. So the summer I graduated, she asked me what I was going to do, and there was no hope. It was the Depression in 1929. The farmers had nothing. And she came over for a visit, and she asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, "I always wanted to be a teacher." She said, "I'll send you, dear." That was it. And then she wouldn't let me try to pay it back even. I asked her when I starting to teach. My salary was only $800 a year, not a month, or a week, like they get now. I had to help at home that year. You know, give money to mom and dad.
Out of your brothers and sister, who were the closest ones to you?
Among the brothers, Jim. You see, Edward and Art were just like twins, almost 2 years apart, and they sort of were great pals and would leave Jim out, so I always sort of sympathized with him or kept him occupied as a young child when they'd go and leave him and he'd cry. So we're still close. And when he was in the Navy, he would come to me. I lived in Montreal then, and he would come there from Halifax. He was only 20 years old when he went in the Navy, so he was glad to come back there when he had leave. And we're still close. He's the one who takes care of me now.
You were pretty happy, I'm sure, when you heard that you had a baby sister.
Oh, yes.
And you and Kath are close today, too.
We are now, but for a number of years I was gone down to Quebec, and she was busy having her 8 children, so we didn't get together at all. I used to send her, we sent bicycles and cribs and things from our family because years people were older. But I didn't see her much, but in the latter years now, we get together at least twice a year and have real good times together. She stayed with me one summer in Montreal and took a business course too. That was nice.
Back on the farm, you said that your dad was quite a guy. Tell me more about him.
He was a grand man, I thought. Well, he taught us so much. I could hardly believe now when I think about it. He had just a grade 4 education and then had to work on a farm. He was a beautiful writer, spoke well, and a very kind man. He always helped his neighbors.
What kind of personality did he have?
Quite placid. I don't remember him ever being really angry or, you know, he never was rough with us or anything. You know, always very calm. I enjoyed him very much. And think now of how smart he was, the things he taught us.
Were both your parents born in Canada?
Yeah, right in and around Elgin.
In that area? What do you remember about their parents?
Not too much. Grandma Hamilton, she was called Eleanor Fitzgerald. I'm named after her, as well as the grandma on the other side was Eleanor too. And she used to come to our house to visit only. She stayed at the homestead, which was where Uncle Charlie and his wife and family lived. But she came to visit at ours frequently. And came to help when there was a baby or
What about her husband? He was a Murphy, right?
no, that's the other side.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hamilton, I'm speaking of, Eleanor Fitzgerald Hamilton. And no, he died and she lived on at the home farm with Uncle Charlie's family.
And what about your mom's side of the family?
Mom's side, her mother died when Mom was a year old. And she was taken care of by an old aunt who lived in the farmhouse. And her dad, John Murphy, built another house on the same land.
Where was this?
Right in Elgin, down, let's see, you go from the village of Elgin east, and it was down in a very, it's kind of a secluded area. The land was given by the government when they came from Ireland, so they took what they got.
They immigrated from Ireland.
They came from Ireland, yeah, 7 of a family. There are a lot of relatives down here, yet of all these Murphys.
Was your mother an intense lady?
No, she was very placid.
Was she?
She didn't have any chance to go anywhere or see much of anything, you know, just a very quiet life. And she was only 20 when they married. She was 20 and Dad was 24. And he had gone out west to earn some money in the wheat fields. And then he came back and they married.
What kind of farm did you grow up on?
It was a very small farm. An old uncle loaned him the money to buy for payment on it, and then he paid it back. I think it was only about 90 acres. It wasn't a very large farm. But he paid that off, and then in the later years, I guess it was when Jack was finishing high school, he thought he would stay on the farm and help Dad, so they sort of bought this larger farm, hoping to keep some of the boys at home. But then Jack got a chance to go away on boats, so then Dad had to look after it alone, but the other boys, as they grew up, helped a lot. But But eventually they had to give it up. They had a large herd of cattle, and it was too much for Dad to do. He made maple syrup there too.
So the income made from the farm, was it primarily from growing animals, milking?
Selling
or-
the milk mostly. We sold milk and eggs and chickens and turkeys.
Did you have to do much of the farm work, or was that mostly the
No,
boys?
I enjoyed some of it though. Like I'd go with Dad to catch turkeys and so on, things like that. The little girl of the family didn't spend much time. I didn't go around the barn. I didn't like it.
No?
I fell in a huge pail of milk one time, and that ended my visits to the barn.
Did your parents get along well?
Yes, as long as I remember, I never. The only fun we had over it, we still told them about it when they were living, that when they decided to paper the kitchen, they had a very large, long room, and Dad would put up these planks and so on. They didn't have proper tools, ladders, and he would try to put a strip of paper the full length of that room, and we all joked, and there was an old song called "When Father Papered the Parlor, You Couldn't See Pop for Paint." You know, he'd get all mixed up. That's the only time I remember them fussing over it or being annoyed with each other that they couldn't do it. But other than that, no, they were fine.
I remember when I grew up that I can't ever remember you and Dad ever having.
We never
an
did.
argument.
We never did.
To what do you attribute that?
Oh, his gentleness, I guess, and love for me, because he was very affectionate always. Was very happy with the way I looked after the children. No, we never really had a quarrel. That's hard to believe, eh?
Tell me about the time in Granby you and Dad bought part of a cottage or something, some land. How did that come about?
Oh, yes, that was fine. We had that for a few years, and we sold it to make a payment on the house in Kingston, because that was too far to drive back. It's a nice little cottage on a spring lake. You remember some of that. You were old enough to have fun up there.
How did that come about? What sort of conversations did you have to come to the decision to
Not too
to
much.
buy
He
that?
found out that it was, I think it was for sale for very little at the time. I don't really, like, he looked after anything like that. I don't really know, but I enjoyed it. And he did too. He'd have the Kiwanis Club up for dinner, and we'd do that, and some of the older Bell people, we've had parties there, and we had friends up for barbecues. It was really a nice life. We could go from our home in the city out there for 50 cents in a taxi. So often I would make dinner and be ready and go, and he'd come from work there. We had very happy times there. We had tennis court or badminton outside, and a nice barbecue. Remember that, with the roof on there? And you had fun in the spring little ponds. You used to pick water lilies for us. You had pet ducks.
What makes you happy today?
Seeing you people and all the family coming whenever everybody comes home, I'm very happy.
What makes you the happiest? What are your happiest times these
Oh.
days? You've got a lot of friends in your...
Yes, I'm very lucky there. I have so many friends. And I have a happy time at the Seniors Club, because many of us are in the same position, like widows, and talk about our families.
Who
and take
are your closest friends
pictures.
there?
Well, I suppose the Warts next door, and then Hilda, my friend, is a retired nurse, Joan Dawson. I have probably 25 good close friends.
What do you guys do?
Oh, I taught craft for quite a few years. I had about 20 people every week and taught craft. A lot of the young people around tell me they learned to crochet and they're still doing it, things like that. I've had a happy life.
Tell me about your relationship with Jean Guess.
Well, I met her in 1925. When we were at convent, when June came, we all felt lonely leaving everybody, going home after living there all the year. So we organized a group, and we'd rent a cottage and share the expenses. The first year in 1925 we went, and when the chaperone added up the expenses and divided among us, I had a 2-week vacation on a lake with a boat and happy times for $5.85. Can you imagine? And we had fun there. We went fishing and all kinds of things. We walked 2 miles to church.
Did you meet Jean Guess through
Then.
the Clarks, or?
No, through the Fowlers. Fidelis Fowler was a friend at the boarding school, and her mom lived in Sydenham, which was right near where we took the cottage at Sydenham Lake. And Jean Guess was a friend of hers. So they came often and brought us a big cake for supper or homemade bread or something, you know, and that's when I met her first. Well, then I met Harriet in 32 when Les had his men staying there. And Frances was a baby, and from then when I would take care of Fran when they went shopping or they were working at the fair, I kept her at 2 years old for the Clarks. So we've been close friends. They used to come to town and bring us out to play bridge and take us back.
What are some of the amusing things that happened as the kids were growing up at home? Angie, Terry, David, Pat.
One of the frightening things, I remember when you came to the back door one day with your arm dangling in a queer position. And I called Les, he was reading the paper, and I said, "Come quickly, David's broken his arm." And he said, "Don't jump to conclusions." We found out you had. Sandy West had tossed you up in the air and you came down on your arm. And then again, you broke it when you fell down from the high ice or snow around a rink. Do you remember that at all? You were about 7. Those were happenings at Granby.
What about when Anne and Jean were teenagers? What was that like?
Well, Jeannie was the one who loved to be outside and going places, so I would sort of assign work for them to do, and she'd disappear. And Anne, I'd say, we'd call her, and Anne would say, "Just let her go, I'd rather do it myself." So Jean was that type that sort of happy and free. Anne was serious. She was a great help to me. She was 14 when you were born, and Pat, around that. So she would come home from school and start supper, make a cake or cookies or something, and she was a real help to me.
Did she have a lot of outside friends?
Yes, seriously though, she just, I guess about 3. She played golf from 10 years old on. And those friends are still friends. She calls Kathy in Kingston when she comes home. They get together.
Jean was the free spirit of the family?
Yes, that's right. She loved to go places and so on. She learned to speak French fluently in Sherbrooke when she went to school there. She's very talented. She took china painting and leatherwork and everything to keep her busy. And when she graduated, she hadn't turned 16, and she won the medal for the province of Quebec.
Speaking of medals, tell me about the one you won.
I don't think I've showed it to you, have I?
No?
You'll see it when you come down next. Well, it was for the high school entrance exams. I told you that. We had to write them in another town. And they came and told me about it in the summertime. I was quite shy and shocked about it. I had no idea. And then presented in Gananoque was quite an adventure.
What was the medal for?
Highest standing. I nearly had perfect marks in all the
In what grade was this?
like grade 8 now. But I just went to school 6 years. You see, I started at 6, there was no kindergarten. And at 12, or at 11, the teacher wanted me to write them, and Mom wouldn't let me. So at 12, she consented.
12 years old, and these were the departmental type exams?
Came from Toronto, yeah. And then...
Tell me about the day that they told you about it.
Well, I don't think I even knew they gave it in the two counties. This medal was donated, but I had not heard about it. The teacher didn't mention try for it or anything. But that's the way it turned out, that I had the highest marks from all these schools in those 2 counties. And I didn't know until one day this beautiful car pulled in the driveway in July. And that'd be after all the tests were added up at the end of June. And it was the inspector of the schools of all the area and the high school teacher from Gananoque told my mother, and I was right there, that I had won this. So we didn't know much about it until later. We got an invitation to come to the teachers' convention where it would be presented. So I went from the boarding school to Gananoque for that.
What was your most memorable holiday?
I think the most fun was at those camps that we went each summer in a group. The friends from boarding school stayed together and went to these very cheap, because none of us had much money. But we had a nice time.
As a family, when you had kids, did you vacation much?
No, we couldn't get away very much. much. Dad and I started to go for a little trip from Granby, from Quebec over into the States and up to Niagara. We thought we would go. And after we crossed the border, he stepped out of the car and twisted his back. And he couldn't really drive. It was a terrible trip home. We had to turn around and come back. That was the only vacation that was planned.
How old were you then?
Well, it was when
Were
we
you
lived
newly
in Granby.
married?
You children were old enough that Grandma and Grandpa were staying with. Then the only trip we had was 1964 after we moved to Kingston. We drove to the coast. And we had planned many things for August of '67. He was going to retire, and we were planning things we'd do and where we'd go, you know, like you do, looking forward to retirement. He died suddenly the 1st of April.
How did you feel about that?
Oh, it was a terrible shock. I don't know whether you remember or not, but I was over in Perth. I'd gone to visit Aunt Ursula. At his suggestion, I drove him to work that morning to a Bell meeting. We sat in the car and listened to the 8 o'clock news, and he said, why don't you go over and see Aunt Ursula today? And he said, we'll be fine this evening. You don't need to come back, stay overnight and have a visit. So I went, and then I got the call from Pat about 7 o'clock that night. Drove home faster than I ever drove in my life. It was really quite a shock.
How did you cope?
Well, I think I coped pretty well, considering it being such a shock, you know. People say, which is worse, a sudden death or your husband sick for a long time. It's hard to say which is worse. I met a friend about a month after, and as I went to the funeral parlor, she met me at the door, and she said, oh, Eleanor, you don't know how lucky you are. Well, I felt anything but lucky. And what she meant was that she had been with her husband for 6 months and couldn't help him. And she meant the sudden death was so much better. But I don't know. When I had never looked after any finances or anything, decisions, I didn't take great part. I trusted him to do things. So that was very hard to have that thrown upon.
What was the hardest part about losing your husband?
Well, I missed him so, the affection, and he was always there, you know, very lonely. For a long time, I imagined I'd hear him coming home, could hear him in the door. And I missed the affection that he showed. He was a very tender person. All the things he helped me with.
What was your biggest help or comfort after Dad died?
Well, I prayed a lot to go through everything. But it was nice. I still had you two for about 2 years. 2 youngest ones at home. And the other 2 girls got married the same summer. And then being occupied at school and with all these dear little children, that helped a lot. I know so many, and now you see, as they're growing up, I still have good contact with them. A lot of them.
If you could think of the person that most affected your life, who would that be?
I guess Aunt Ursula giving me the chance to become a teacher.
Who's your closest friend?
Oh, Marge Quinn. She's now Mrs. Brady. She was my bridesmaid at the wedding. And then Frances McCauley, I guess, next. Then the others around Amherstfield. I haven't kept in touch very much with those who were very good friends in Granby. It's so far away that we sort of drifted. I hear from them once in a while.
Well, that's due for now. Let's take a break and we'll talk some more later.
Long story.
We'll come back. Well, Mom, here we are again. It's now the day after Christmas, Boxing Day 1994. And I'm going to finish off our little chat here. I guess you can call this a fireside chat. It's a Christmas tree chat, I guess. But I'd like to take you back now again to growing up on the farm. And as you think about growing up on the farm, Tell me about any little sibling rivalries that maybe your brothers had when they were growing up. Not necessarily with yourself, but maybe among themselves. Who interacted with who